Hey there, my friends. Before we dive into one of the most powerful stories in the Bible, I want you to imagine something for a second. Picture yourself in a situation where you have a clear goal in front of you, but the path to achieving that goal seems completely strange. You're told to do something that doesn't seem to make any logical sense at all. How would you react? Would you follow the instructions, even though they seem out of the ordinary? Well, today, we're going to look at a story where the Israelites were in just that kind of situation. They had a clear mission: conquer the city of Jericho, but the way God instructed them to do it was anything but conventional. It's a story that teaches us a powerful lesson about obedience, trust, and God's divine plan. And it's one of those stories that gets us thinking, what would I do if I were in their shoes? So, what happened? The Israelites were about to face their first big challenge as they entered the Promised Land. They were standing right before the city of Jericho, a city with massive walls built to withstand sieges and enemies. But God didn't tell them to bring battering rams, nor did He instruct them to fight with swords and shields. Instead, He gave them a plan that sounded pretty bizarre. Why is this important for us today? Because sometimes God asks us to do things that don't make sense to the world. It could be something as simple as showing kindness when we feel hurt, or choosing peace when conflict seems easier. But God has a greater perspective, a plan that we may not always see immediately. In the story of Jericho, we see how obedience opens the door for God to do the impossible. The Israelites could have questioned God, just like we sometimes question His directions. They could have thought, why march around the city in silence? Why wait for 7 days? But instead, they trusted and obeyed. And that's where the miracle began. And just like that, my friends, there are miracles in store for you too. You might not see it yet, but your obedience today, in whatever God is calling you to, is laying the groundwork for something powerful in your life. I know it's not always easy. Sometimes it's hard to understand why God's way is the way we should go. But let me ask you this. Have you ever regretted obeying God's lead? I know I haven't. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, I want to remind you to hit that like button if you're ready to explore how faith and obedience led to one of the greatest victories in history. And don't forget to comment below. Let me know, have you ever had a time in your life when God's plan didn't make sense, but you decided to trust Him anyway? I'd love to hear your stories. Now, let's take a look at how the Israelites, despite their doubts and fears, were able to walk in obedience and witness the miraculous. Let's explore the Battle of Jericho, not just as a historical event, but as a powerful lesson in trusting God's ways, even when we don't have all the answers. Ready? Let's dive in. All right, let's dive into the heart of this story, the plan. It's a moment in history that might make you scratch your head and think, wait, did I hear that correctly? God gave the Israelites instructions that seem completely bizarre. From a human perspective, the city of Jericho had thick, strong walls. No ordinary army could just march around it and expect the walls to fall down, right? But that's exactly what God told them to do. In Joshua 6:3-5, God gave the Israelites this unusual command: march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Doesn't that sound strange? Marching around a fortified city, with priests blowing trumpets, expecting the walls to fall down. I mean, it's not exactly the typical battle strategy, is it? But here's the thing, friends. God's plan wasn't about the Israelites' military strength or how much noise they could make. It was about their faith and obedience to God's word. You see, God didn't ask them to come up with their own ideas. He gave them a specific plan, and they were asked to trust Him completely, even when it seemed nonsensical. Can you imagine what the Israelites must have thought as they began marching around Jericho on the first day? They didn't see any immediate results. They didn't see the walls cracking or the city trembling. They just walked. And then they did the same thing. The next day, and the next, and the next. 6 days of silence walking around the city. No shouting, no attacking, no visible progress. But here's the kicker. Each day they were learning to trust God more and more. Faith in action isn't about seeing the outcome immediately, it's about trusting the process even when it doesn't. Makes sense. Every step they took was a step toward God's victory, and they didn't know how it would end. But God did. You see, obedience often feels like a long road with no clear results, but that's exactly when God works in the most powerful ways. The Israelites didn't know what was going to happen on the seventh day. They had no idea that, after all that marching, the walls would finally collapse. But God knew, He always knows, and that's the beauty of His plan. Think about your life for a moment. Maybe you're walking through a situation right now where you don't see the result. Maybe you're walking in faith, doing the right thing, but the results aren't immediately visible. Perhaps it feels like you're marching in silence and you're wondering, God, when will I see a breakthrough? Keep walking. Keep trusting. Just like the Israelites, your faithfulness, even when you don't see progress, is preparing the way for your breakthrough. God's plan doesn't always make sense, but it's always perfect. When the Israelites were walking around Jericho, they weren't just walking. They were taking steps of faith, knowing that God's timing was perfect and His promises were sure. And on that seventh day, when they shouted, the walls came crashing down. What does this teach us? It teaches us that obedience and faith are the keys to experiencing God's power in our lives. Sometimes all God asks is that we trust Him, even when His plan doesn't make sense to us. So I want to ask you, what is God calling you to do that seems unusual or difficult right now? Is there something you're being asked to do that doesn't seem to make sense? Keep going. Keep trusting. When we follow His plan, we're setting ourselves up for victory, just like the Israelites did. Remember, the path to victory isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Just as God led His people to a miraculous victory in Jericho, He's leading you through your journey, step by step, day by day, one act of faith at a time. Now, as we continue through this story, think about how this lesson applies to your own life. Are there areas where you've been questioning God's instructions? Are you ready to trust Him fully even if you don't understand the plan right now? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts and experiences with stepping out in faith, even when things don't make sense. Let's keep walking in faith together. Let's pause for a moment and focus on the power of obedience in this story. God gave the Israelites a clear command to march around the city of Jericho for 7 days. It wasn't just about following orders, it was about aligning themselves with God's plan even when they couldn't fully understand it. Imagine being in their shoes. You've come out of the wilderness after 40 years. You've seen God's power in amazing ways. And now you're about to face your first major battle in the Promised Land. But instead of rushing into the fight with weapons drawn, God tells you to march silently around the city for 6 days. What kind of challenge is that? It's easy to think, why not just attack? The answer lies in the fact that obedience to God is not always about the way we would naturally do things. God's plans often require faith, patience, and the ability to follow His commands even when it feels illogical or inefficient. We are often conditioned to think that the more effort we put into something, the more we should see immediate results. But with God, it's not always about what we do, it's about trusting His timing. On the first day, the Israelites must have walked in silence, circling the city with no visible signs of progress. The walls of Jericho were thick, strong, and seemingly impenetrable. Yet God was teaching them something far more profound than strategy or physical strength. He was teaching them that faithful obedience to His word was the key to victory. For 6 days, the Israelites trusted that God knew what He was doing. They obeyed even though the outcome wasn't immediately clear to them. Think about this for a second. God didn't tell them to make noise on the first 6 days. He didn't tell them to take action right away. He simply told them to obey, and they did. Obedience is powerful because it brings us into alignment with God's will, and when we are aligned with God's will, we open ourselves to His power to work in our lives in ways we cannot even imagine. Let's take a step back and think about your own life. Are there areas where God is asking you to walk in obedience, even when it doesn't make sense? Maybe you feel like you're walking in silence, doing what you've been asked to do, but not seeing any immediate results. That's okay. In fact, it's normal. God doesn't promise immediate results for our obedience. What He promises is that his plans are better, and that he is faithful to bring them to fruition in his perfect timing. The Israelites didn't know that the walls of Jericho were about to collapse when they marched on the seventh day. They didn't know that their obedience would lead to a miracle. And yet, by faithfully following God's instructions, they were positioning themselves for the victory that God had already prepared for them. On the seventh day, God asked them to do something even more significant. After marching around the city for 6 days, they were to march around 7 times and then shout with all their might. Imagine the tension building up as they prepared to make that final, monumental shout. After 6 days of silence, one final act of faith was all that stood between them and victory. When they followed through, the walls came crashing down. This moment wasn't just a display of power. It was a testimony of God's faithfulness when we choose to walk in obedience. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of the Israelites' strength or strategy. They fell because of their obedience to God's instructions and their faith in His power. This is where the true power lies. Obedience and faith go hand in hand. Our obedience doesn't guarantee that everything will go as we expect, but it does open the door for God to do what only He can do. Imagine if the Israelites had decided not to obey. What if they had doubted the plan halfway through or stopped? Marching on the 6th day, they would have missed the miracle. Now let's apply this to our lives today. How often do we feel like giving up, especially when we can't see immediate results? How often do we doubt God's plan because it doesn't make sense from our perspective? The story of Jericho shows us that obedience is not about understanding everything. It's about trusting the one who does. Are you facing a Jericho-like situation in your life? Maybe it's a problem that seems insurmountable, something that you've been battling for what feels like forever. You've been doing what God has asked you to do, but the walls haven't fallen yet. Don't stop. Don't give up. Keep marching in faith. Keep trusting that God's plan is better than anything you could imagine. When the time is right, those walls will fall, and you will experience a victory that you couldn't have orchestrated on your own. As we think about the power of obedience, we can also reflect on how this applies to our own walk with God. What has God asked you to do that feels difficult or unclear? Are you willing to keep walking, even when you don't see the outcome right away? I want to encourage you to trust that God is leading you step by step. Just like the Israelites, your obedience will position you for a miracle, not just in the future, but even in the present moment. So let's reflect together. How does this story challenge you in your walk of obedience? What areas of your life are you called to trust God even when you don't fully understand? Let's talk about it in the comments below. I'd love to hear how God is working in your life through faith and obedience. And don't forget, keep marching in faith. Victory is on the way. Let's focus on God's presence in this story. The Israelites didn't just march around the city in silence for no reason. Each action had a profound purpose, and ultimately, it was about the power of God's presence going before them. When the Israelites were told to march, it wasn't just an exercise in endurance or military strategy. It was God Himself guiding them to victory. The walls of Jericho would not fall because of the Israelites' strength or military might, but because God's presence was in the midst of it all. Now picture this. After 7 days of marching and silence, the 7th day arrived. It was the moment when the Israelites were asked to shout. This wasn't just any shout. It was a shout of faith and trust. It wasn't the strength of their voices that would bring down the walls, but the overwhelming presence of God's power that accompanied their obedience. Imagine that. After marching for days, silently waiting, the moment arrives for the Israelites to declare the victory in faith. Why is this moment so significant? Because it teaches us that God's presence, coupled with our obedience, brings about victory. It wasn't about what they did in their own power, it was about acknowledging that God was with them in their journey. When we face our own Jericho, walls won't whatever they may be, personal struggles, challenges, or even doubts, God's presence is the key to our victory. Just like the Israelites, we must walk in obedience, trusting that His power is working behind the scenes. Now think about your own life. How often do we try to tackle challenges on our own without inviting God's presence into the situation? There are times when we feel like we need to fight our battles alone, but God wants to be present with us in our struggles. We need to invite His presence into our lives daily, just like the Israelites had to trust that His presence would work as they marched around Jericho. Without that trust, without inviting Him into the process, we risk missing out on the victory that's already been won for us. When the Israelites shouted, they were not just yelling out of frustration or impatience. No, their shout was a declaration of faith, a belief that God would do exactly what He had promised. And when they shouted, the walls fell. What would have happened if they had given up before the seventh day? What if they had doubted and not shouted at all? The walls would have stayed standing, but their obedience, their trust, and the power of God's presence brought about the miracle. This brings us to a crucial point. In our own lives, we need to recognize that God's presence is a game changer. His presence in our lives isn't just something nice to have, it's essential for breaking down walls. Whether we're dealing with personal struggles, relationships, or even larger societal challenges, we need to ask ourselves, are we inviting God's presence into these situations? Think about what happens when we rely solely on ourselves and leave God out of the equation. We're left trying to fight battles that are bigger than us. But when we walk with God and trust that He is with us, things begin to change. Walls start to crumble, mountains start to move, and victories start to manifest in ways we never imagined possible. God's presence is not something to take for granted. When we shout in faith, when we call upon His name, we are acknowledging that He alone has the power to overcome the giants in our lives. He is the one who goes before us, fighting our battles, preparing the way, and delivering us from evil. Now, think about this. Have you invited God's presence into your struggles? Have you trusted Him enough to let Him fight for you rather than trying to handle it on your own? This story is not just about ancient battles, it's a timeless principle. Faith, obedience, and the presence of God are the winning combination for overcoming any challenge we face. We need to remember that we are not alone in our struggles. God is right there with us. Take a moment right now to reflect. Are there areas in your life where you need God's presence more? Is there a wall in your life that seems too big to break through? Remember, with God's presence, nothing is impossible. And here's the great part. You don't have to wait for some distant future moment for God's presence to break through in your life. You can start inviting Him in right now. Just like the Israelites, you may not see the results immediately, but trusting in God's presence and following His guidance will lead you to victory. Shout in faith, just like they did, and trust that the walls will come down. Let's talk about this. I'd love to hear from you. What walls are you facing in your life, and how can God's presence help you overcome them? Let's continue the conversation in the comments below. Remember, God is with you, and with His presence you will have the victory. When we look at the story of the Battle of Jericho, we cannot ignore the overwhelming power of obedience. The Israelites had a plan that didn't make sense in the natural world. They were instructed by God to march around the city for 7 days without speaking a word, but they obeyed, and that obedience led to their victory. This shows us that when we choose to follow God's instructions, regardless of how unusual or difficult they may seem, we are setting ourselves up for victory. Let's pause for a moment and think about obedience in our own lives. How often do we hesitate to follow God's commands because we can't see the full picture? Maybe God tells us to forgive someone who hurt us, or to act in a way that seems counterproductive to our immediate goals. It doesn't always make sense, does it? Yet the Israelites were given a command that seemed completely illogical. Marching around a fortified city for days without speaking a word. It didn't seem like it could work, but God knew better, didn't He? Obedience to God's will can lead us to unexpected victories, just like it did for the Israelites at Jericho. The act of obedience required more than just going through the motions. It required faith. The Israelites had to believe that God knew what He was doing. They had to trust that the strategy He gave them was for their good, even though it didn't make sense from a military standpoint. Can you imagine the thoughts going through their minds as they walked around the walls of Jericho each day? They were probably thinking, what's going to happen? Are we really doing this right? They were faced with the uncertainty of their situation, yet they trusted God's voice over their own doubts and fears. When they obeyed God's instructions, they didn't just passively follow orders, they actively trusted in Him. And that trust is what allowed them to see God's power at work. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of the Israelites' strategic genius or their strength. No, the walls fell because of their obedience to God's command and His power moving through them. This teaches us something incredibly important. Obedience releases the power of God in our lives. When we act according to His will, amazing things can happen. But what does obedience look like in our own lives? It doesn't always look like marching around a city or waiting for a miracle to happen. Sometimes obedience is about choosing to follow God, even when the situation doesn't make sense. It's about trusting Him, even when we don't have all the answers. It's about acting in faith, knowing that God's plan is always better than our own. The Bible tells us in James 1:22 that we are to be doers of the word and not hearers only. Obedience is more than just hearing God's word. It's about putting it into action. Now think about this. What areas of your life require obedience today? Maybe there's something God has asked you to do that you've been putting off, or maybe there's a decision you're unsure about. Just like the Israelites, it's easy to doubt God's plan when we don't understand it. But here's the thing. Obedience to God's will is never in vain. When we trust His leading, He will always be faithful to guide us, just like He did the Israelites to their victory. As we think about the Israelites' obedience, we realize that this story isn't just about military strategy, it's about faith. The Israelites didn't know exactly how the walls would fall. They just knew that God had given them an instruction, and if they followed it, He would bring the victory. Their obedience was an act of faith. Sometimes we can't see the full picture or understand how God's instructions will work out. But obedience means trusting that He sees what we cannot and that His plan is perfect. When we obey God, we align ourselves with His purpose, and in doing so, we open the door for Him to move in ways that we couldn't imagine. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of anything the Israelites did. They fell because God responded to their obedience. And in the same way, when we obey God, He responds in powerful ways. Obedience sets the stage for God's miraculous work in our lives. Now let's ask ourselves, what do you believe God is calling you to do right now? Is there something in your life that you're holding back from fully surrendering to Him? Just like the Israelites, obedience might feel strange, it might feel difficult, and it might not make sense at first, but in the end, it leads to victory. God honors our obedience, and just like the walls of Jericho, nothing is too strong for God to break down when we act in faith and obedience. Take a moment to reflect. What is God asking of you today? Are you ready to take that step of obedience? Let me know in the comments below, and let's talk about the incredible power of obedience and faith together. Because just like the Israelites, we too can experience victory through God's power when we obey His call. Joshua's role in the Battle of Jericho goes far beyond being the general of the Israelite army. It speaks to the essence of godly leadership and courage. In Joshua 6, we see a man who is obedient to God's command, and in turn, he leads the Israelites to one of the most miraculous victories in the Bible. But what was it about Joshua that made him the right leader for this incredible moment in history? How did his faith and courage help him carry out God's plan for the Israelites? First, let's consider Joshua's background. Joshua wasn't just chosen out of nowhere. He had spent years serving Moses, learning from one of the greatest leaders in the history of Israel. He had seen firsthand how God worked through Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Joshua knew what it meant to follow God's will and how important it was to rely on God's strength, not his own. He had witnessed God's faithfulness in the wilderness, and now he was called to step into a position of leadership that would demand complete faith and total obedience to God's guidance. In Joshua 1, God gives him a clear command: be strong and courageous. This is a powerful message, isn't it? We often think of courage as something that comes from within ourselves, but in this case, it was God telling Joshua that courage was a result of trusting him. Courage, according to God, is rooted in faith. Joshua wasn't being asked to rely on his own strength or military skill, but to trust in God's plan. just as Moses had. In the same way, our courage to face life's battles isn't found in our abilities, but in the trust we place in God's promises and power. Now let's think about the moment of the battle. God gives Joshua a seemingly strange command: to march around the city of Jericho with the army for 7 days, blowing trumpets, but saying nothing. Can you imagine the pressure Joshua must have felt? He had to communicate this plan to his people, and they had to trust him. Joshua's leadership didn't just involve strategic planning. It involved rallying the people to believe in a plan that defied natural reason. Yet Joshua did not hesitate to obey God's command, even though the plan didn't make sense from a military perspective. Leadership is not about having all the answers or making sure everything is understood. It's about trusting God's will, even when the path ahead seems unclear. Joshua led with a deep understanding that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that when we obey God, even in the most unlikely of circumstances, we position ourselves for victory. The walls of Jericho fell not because of Joshua's military genius, but because he followed God's instruction to the letter, trusting in God's power and not his own. But what can we learn from Joshua's courage and obedience today? We all face challenges in our lives, whether it's a decision we have to make, an obstacle we need to overcome, or even a battle against our own fears and doubts. The courage that Joshua demonstrated doesn't come from being fearless. It comes from trusting that God is with us, that He has a plan for our lives, and that He is faithful to bring us through whatever challenges we face. Joshua's courage was grounded in God's promises. Joshua's faith in God's plan wasn't just about getting a victory over Jericho. It was about knowing that no matter what happened, God would be faithful to His word. This kind of faith challenges us, doesn't it? Do we trust God enough to obey Him even when it seems illogical? Do we have the courage to follow God's direction even when it's not what we would expect? This type of leadership isn't just for those in positions of authority, it's for all of us. We are all called to lead with courage and faith in our daily lives, whether it's leading our families, our communities, or just taking personal steps toward living the life God has called us to. Joshua's courage can be an inspiration for us all to trust that God's plan is greater than anything we can imagine. As we continue to reflect on the story of Joshua, it's important to ask ourselves, how is God calling us to lead? Whether it's in big decisions or everyday situations, how can we step out in faith like Joshua did and trust God's plan even when it doesn't make sense? Just like Joshua, we are called to be strong and courageous, and to know that when we follow God's direction, we position ourselves for victory, just like the Israelites did at Jericho. Joshua's leadership wasn't based on his strength or his strategy. It was based on his obedience to God's word. When we lead with obedience, trusting that God knows what's best, we too can expect to see His power at work in our lives. So as you go through your day, ask yourself, how can I lead with courage and faith, knowing that God is with me just like He was with Joshua? Let's reflect on that for a moment. What's one area of your life where you can step out in faith and trust God's plan? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's talk about how we can all lead with the same courage that Joshua demonstrated. Joshua's leadership during the Battle of Jericho is an incredible display of obedience to God's commands. When we talk about obedience, we often think of it as simply following instructions. But in the case of Joshua, his obedience was more than just a task to complete. It was a testimony of his faith, his trust in God's word, and his willingness to submit to God's will, even when the commands seemed strange or difficult to understand. Imagine for a moment, you're Joshua, standing on the edge of Jericho, looking at the towering city walls, knowing that this city is the key to the Israelites entering the Promised Land. God gives you a command: march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, march around it 7 times, blow the trumpets, and the walls will fall. That's it. There's no mention of swords, no battle strategy, no weapons to break down the walls, just a command to obey. Obedience in such a scenario is not easy. Joshua's faith was put to the test. How could he be sure that this plan would work? It made no logical sense from a military standpoint, but Joshua wasn't concerned with logic. He was concerned with obedience to God. This is the first lesson we can draw from Joshua's example. Obedience is not about understanding the plan. It's about trusting the one who gives the plan. Let's reflect on this for a moment. How often do we question God's commands because they don't make sense to us? When we are asked to do something that doesn't fit into our understanding or logic, it's easy to hesitate or even refuse. But Joshua's example challenges us to trust that God's plan is greater than our understanding. Joshua's obedience to God's instructions also taught the Israelites something powerful. The victory they would experience was a result of their faith and obedience to God, not their own efforts. God was the one who brought the victory, and their obedience was the key to seeing his power at work. The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of the Israelites' military prowess. They fell because God had a plan, and the Israelites chose to follow it. Obedience is a key element of faith. In Matthew 7:24-27, Jesus talks about the wise man who built his house on the rock, hearing and obeying his words. He tells us that those who hear his words and put them into practice are like the wise man. Joshua was that wise man. His obedience wasn't just an outward act. It was an expression of his trust in God's faithfulness. He didn't need to see the walls fall before he obeyed. He believed that God would do what he promised. This brings us to another important point. Obedience to God often requires perseverance. Joshua didn't receive a quick answer or immediate results. For 6 days, the Israelites marched around Jericho, facing potential ridicule, doubt, and fatigue. But they didn't give up. They kept obeying, trusting that God was at work, even when the outcome wasn't yet visible. Obedience to God often requires us to keep going, even when we don't see immediate results. We may not always understand why we're being asked to do something, and sometimes it may feel like nothing is happening. But that's where faith comes in. Obedience requires faith that God is doing something, even when we don't see it right away. This lesson of obedience isn't just for leaders. Like Joshua, it's for all of us. We are all called to obey God's commands in our daily lives. But how often do we neglect or ignore God's instructions because they don't align with what we think is best? Joshua's obedience reminds us that obedience isn't about comfort. It's about trusting God and his plan, even when it's difficult. Joshua's obedience also teaches us the importance of following through on God's commands. The Israelites could have marched around Jericho once or twice and then decided to give up because they didn't see the walls falling. But they didn't. They followed God's instructions to the letter, and the result was miraculous. God's commands are always followed by his promises. When we obey him, we can trust that he will bring about his plans in our lives, just like he did for Joshua and the Israelites. Let's bring this lesson into our own lives. What areas of your life is God calling you to obey him? Are there things that he has asked you to do that you've been hesitant to follow through on because they don't make sense? Remember, God's plan for your life is greater than your understanding. Trust in his plan and obey his commands, even when you don't. See the whole picture. Joshua's obedience wasn't just a momentary decision, it was a lifestyle. He had learned to trust God's commands and follow them, and as a result, he saw God move in powerful ways. When we choose to live a life of obedience to God, we position ourselves to experience his power at work in our lives. As we reflect on Joshua's leadership and obedience, let's remember that God is calling us to trust him fully and to follow his commands without hesitation. Obedience isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. God's plans for us are always good, and when we obey, we experience his blessings. Let's take a moment to reflect. What areas of your life is God calling you to obey him? Are there places where you're hesitating to take that step of faith? Joshua's story teaches us that obedience leads to victory, and the same is true for us. So let's take that step of faith and obey God, trusting that he will do the rest. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How does Joshua's example of obedience inspire you? What steps of obedience is God calling you to take today? Let's share our thoughts and encourage each other in the comments. Let's talk about something that resonates with all of us: overcoming obstacles. We all face challenges in life, whether it's a personal struggle, a family issue, a financial setback, or a crisis of faith. We all hit roadblocks that seem impossible to overcome. But here's the truth. Faith and obedience are the keys to overcoming obstacles. And that's exactly what we learn from the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Imagine yourself in the shoes of the Israelites. You've just crossed the Jordan River and you're standing on the edge of the Promised Land. Your journey has been long, full of trials and challenges, but the land is finally within reach. However, there's one big problem: Jericho. It's a city with massive walls that seem impregnable, and it's standing right in your way. It's an obstacle that seems too big to overcome. But God doesn't leave them without a plan. In Joshua 6, he gives Joshua a seemingly impossible command. March around the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day march around it 7 times, blow trumpets, and the walls will fall. Now at this point, Joshua could have doubted. This plan makes no logical sense. No siege weapons, no military strategy, just marching and trumpeting. Would you have followed this command without question? It takes a lot of faith and obedience to follow something that seems completely illogical, but that's exactly the point. God's ways are not our ways. His understanding is higher than ours. Faith is trusting in God's plan, even when we don't. Understand it. Obedience is the action that follows that trust, no matter how strange or difficult the command might seem. And that's how obstacles are overcome. The Israelites had to believe that God's plan was greater than their understanding of the situation, and then they had to obey his instructions completely. Let's pause for a second. What obstacles are you facing in your life right now? Maybe it's a situation that seems impossible to solve. Maybe it feels like the walls around you are too high, too thick, too strong. But what if God is calling you to trust in his plan and obey him even when it doesn't make sense? The story of Jericho teaches us that obedience is often the key to breakthrough. When we align ourselves with God's will, even in the midst of impossible circumstances, he shows up in ways that we can't even imagine. Now, let's talk about the power of God's word. The Israelites didn't just go out there marching for no reason. They were acting on God's word. When God speaks, his words are filled with power. Joshua 1:8 reminds us to keep the book of the law always on our lips, meditating on it day and night, so that we can be careful to do everything written in it. God had already promised the Israelites the land, and his word was what they were holding on to as they marched toward Jericho. God's promises are our strength in the face of obstacles. When we face challenges, we must remind ourselves of his promises and hold tightly to his word. Think about this for a moment. The Israelites didn't just face physical walls in Jericho. They were facing internal obstacles too. They had to overcome their fear, their doubt, and their own limited thinking. Faith doesn't just move physical obstacles, it moves us to act beyond our limitations. And obedience is the act of moving forward, even when we're not sure how it's all going to work out. By choosing to obey, they were stepping out in faith, trusting that God would do what he said he would do. And as we know, he did. The walls of Jericho fell because of their faith and obedience. But here's the thing. Obstacles are not just challenges we face once, they are recurring. After Jericho, the Israelites had to face many other challenges, and we will too. Life is full of obstacles. But the good news is that the formula for overcoming them never changes. It's faith and obedience. Faith in God's promises and obedience to his commands are the tools we need to see God move mountains in our lives. Let's make it even more personal. What's your Jericho? Maybe it's a relationship that feels broken. Maybe it's a situation that's been dragging on for years, and you don't see a way out. But just like the Israelites, you're being called to trust in God's plan, to keep moving forward, and to be obedient to what he's asking you to do, even when it feels impossible. Obedience doesn't always mean we see immediate results, but it does mean we trust God in the process. As we talk about overcoming obstacles, remember that you don't have to face them alone. Just like the Israelites, God is walking with you through every challenge. Faith is not about waiting for the perfect circumstances. It's about trusting that God is with you in the imperfect ones. The Israelites walked in faith for 7 days before they saw the walls come down. What walls are you waiting to see come down in your life? Keep walking, keep obeying, and trust that God's plan is unfolding. Before we wrap up, let me ask you again. What's your Jericho? What obstacles are you facing right now? And how can faith and obedience help you overcome them? Take a moment to think about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about how we can encourage one another in our faith and obedience, knowing that, like the Israelites, we are walking toward victory. The story of Jericho is not just a story from the past, it's a story for today. It's a reminder that with God, no obstacle is too great to overcome. And when we choose faith and obedience, we're choosing victory. Thank you for listening, and remember to hit like if this message encouraged you, subscribe for more powerful insights, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Keep the faith and keep walking in obedience. God has great things ahead. Faith and obedience go hand in hand, especially when it comes to overcoming obstacles that seem insurmountable. The story of Joshua leading the Israelites into the Promised Land gives us an incredible example of how obedience to God's commands and faith in His promises work together to bring about the impossible. Let's take a moment to reflect on what this looks like in real life. Joshua was asked by God to lead the Israelites into the land of Canaan, a land promised to them by God. But there was a problem. The land was already occupied, and the people living there were strong. But the most significant obstacle they faced was the city of Jericho. The walls of Jericho were towering, and it seemed impossible for the Israelites to conquer the city. Imagine being Joshua for a moment. You've seen the miraculous acts of God throughout your journey, but now you're facing something that seems unbeatable. The walls of Jericho were fortified, built to withstand attacks. The city seemed like an immovable object. Have you ever faced a situation that felt like Jericho? Something so big, so powerful, that it felt like there was no way through or around it? This is where obedience plays such a crucial role. God gives Joshua a seemingly strange command to march around the city once every day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, blow the trumpets, and then the walls would fall. If you were Joshua, how would you react to this? This plan didn't involve swords or weapons, no military strategy. It was a simple act of faith and obedience, but it was exactly what God wanted. The act of marching around Jericho wasn't just a random command. It was a symbol of obedience to God's instructions. Joshua and the Israelites didn't question it. They trusted God completely, knowing that His plan, although it didn't make sense to human eyes, was perfect and would bring victory. Obedience isn't always about understanding the plan. It's about trusting the one who created the plan. Let's pause for a moment. How often do we struggle to obey when God gives us a command that doesn't make sense? Maybe God has been asking you to step out in faith in a particular area of your life, but you're hesitant because the plan doesn't seem to fit with your expectations or understanding. That's where faith comes in. Faith is trusting that God's way is higher than our way, and obedience is the action that follows that trust. As the Israelites walked around Jericho, they faced their own doubts and fears. They couldn't see the walls coming down, but their obedience was a sign that they believed in God's word. Obedience to God's command requires action, and the Israelites were willing to take action, even when the outcome wasn't visible. That's a powerful lesson for us today. Obedience means moving forward even when we can't see the results. After the 7th day, when the Israelites had completed the final lap around the city, the walls of Jericho came down. It wasn't because of anything the Israelites did, but because of God's miraculous power. This victory wasn't about military might. It was about faith and obedience to God's instructions. Now let's think about our own Jerichos. We all face challenges in life that feel impossible to overcome. Maybe it's a broken relationship, a financial crisis, or a health issue that seems too big to tackle. These are the Jerichos in our lives, and just like the Israelites, we are called to respond with faith and obedience. Obedience doesn't always make sense to us, but when we trust in God's plan and act on it, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles, we open the door for God's power to work in our lives. Obedience may not always result in instant victory, but it positions us for breakthrough. When we step out in faith, trusting God, we align ourselves with His divine plan, and that's when the walls begin to fall. So let's ask ourselves, what areas of our lives need obedience to God's commands? Are there walls that we've been looking at for a long time, feeling hopeless, feeling like there's no way through? This is the moment to put our faith into action. Just like Joshua and the Israelites, we are called to march forward in obedience, trusting that God will move the mountains in our lives. When we face obstacles, remember that obedience to God's plan is always the first step. We may not understand how it will happen or what the next step looks like, but God is faithful, and when we obey, He will make a way. The walls of Jericho came down, not by force, but by faith and obedience. This is the victory we are called to experience in our own lives. Let's reflect for a moment. What is your Jericho today? What seems impossible in your life right now? What is God calling you to do in order to move forward in obedience? Take a moment to think about it. Obeying. God's plan for our lives may not always be easy, but it always leads to victory. Just like the Israelites, we are called to trust and obey. In closing, I want to encourage you. No matter how big your obstacles may seem, God is greater. Faith and obedience will see you through. Trust in His plan, obey His instructions, and watch as He brings down the walls in your life. Victory is on the other side of your obedience. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What is God calling you to obey today? Let's encourage each other as we walk in faith, trusting that God will do the impossible. We've all faced obstacles that seem insurmountable, challenges that make us question our faith or wonder if we'll ever see a breakthrough. Life throws us curveballs. From financial difficulties to personal struggles, it can sometimes feel like we're trapped in situations with no way out. But here's the powerful truth we need to remember. God's promises are greater than any challenge we face. The story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea is one of the most profound examples of God's ability to deliver His people from impossible situations. In Exodus 14, the Israelites were in a bind. They had just been freed from slavery in Egypt, but now they were facing the Red Sea in front of them and the Egyptian army behind them. They were stuck. There was no way forward and no way backward. The odds were stacked against them. Can you relate to feeling like you're stuck, with no way forward and no way back? But God had a plan. Even when the situation seemed impossible, God made a way. He instructed Moses to raise his staff over the Red Sea, and God parted the waters, allowing the Israelites to walk through on dry ground. The Egyptians, in pursuit, tried to follow, but were swallowed by the returning waters. The victory wasn't just a physical deliverance. It was a spiritual testimony of God's power to overcome the most impossible of circumstances. How often do we find ourselves standing before our own Red Sea moments, facing situations that seem impossible, with no way forward and no way back? Maybe it's an overwhelming challenge at work, a strained relationship, or a personal trial that has you feeling stuck. But just like the Israelites, we need to remember that God's promises are not just words. They are powerful tools that make a way when there seems to be no way. Now let's reflect on what happened after the Red Sea was parted. The Israelites didn't just move forward, they celebrated the victory. They sang praises to God, acknowledging that it was only through His power that they were able to overcome the enemy. This moment of deliverance was not just a physical event, it was a spiritual victory. They recognized that God had been faithful to His promise to deliver them, and they trusted Him more deeply because of it. But here's the question: how do we respond when God brings us through our own challenges? Do we give Him the glory, or do we quickly forget what He has done for us? Celebrating God's deliverance is essential to growing in our faith. When we see His hand in our lives, it builds our confidence in His ability to provide, protect, and guide us through the toughest of situations. Let's think about the Red Sea moment in a more personal context. Maybe your Red Sea is the fear of the unknown. You've been through hardship and you're unsure what the future holds. Perhaps it's a financial crisis or a health issue that feels overwhelming. Whatever it may be, God is calling us to trust Him in those moments. Just like He parted the Red Sea for the Israelites, He will make a way for you too. But first, we have to trust and move forward in faith. In Matthew 17:20, Jesus said, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move." Faith isn't about having everything figured out. It's about trusting God even when we don't know the outcome. It's about believing that no matter how impossible the situation seems, God will provide a way. When we have faith, we open the door for God to do what only He can do. When we think about God's promises, we're reminded that He never abandons His people. The Israelites were delivered not because of their own strength, but because of God's faithfulness to His covenant. God is not a man that He should lie, Numbers 23:19, and His promises are sure. In the face of the impossible, we can stand firm on the truth that God's promises will always prevail. So how does this apply to us today? We live in a world filled with trials and struggles, but the promise of victory through faith remains unchanged. We don't have to be afraid of the Red Seas in our lives. Instead, we can look forward in hope, knowing that God is with us, ready to part the waters and lead us to victory. Our faith is the key to unlocking God's power in our lives. Let's take a moment to think, what is your Red Sea today? What impossible situation are you facing? Is it a personal challenge, a financial burden, or something else? Now imagine the power of God at work in that situation. It may seem impossible, but with God all things are possible. He is the same God who parted the Red Sea, and He is faithful to part the waters for you too. But it's not just about deliverance, it's about living in victory. The Israelites didn't just walk through the Red Sea and move on, they celebrated the victory. When we see God's power at work in our lives, we must celebrate His faithfulness. It strengthens our faith and reminds us that He is always with us, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. In conclusion, God's promises are more powerful than any obstacle we face. Whether it's a personal struggle or a situation that seems impossible, we can trust in His faithfulness. The same God who parted the Red Sea is with us today, making a way when there seems to be no way. We are called to step forward in faith, knowing that our victory is certain because God is with us. And when He brings us through, we will celebrate His faithfulness and share His goodness with others. Reflect on this for a moment. How has God already parted the Red Seas in your life? Share in the comments below, and let's encourage each other with testimonies of God's faithfulness. Remember, God is greater than any challenge you face, and His promises are always true. Let's walk in faith and trust that He will make a way for us, just as He did for the Israelites.